Hello, in this part of the tutorial I am going to take you through the online HERA tutorials so you can have an opportunity to play with a machine ethics system if that's something you are interested in doing. So there are several tutorials in the HERA blog. I linked 3 from the HERA introduction I did, but in fact there are 2 kinds of model that HERA works with. One are causal agency models, which ask about the acceptability of a single action, and there are plan-based models which ask about the acceptability of a sequence of plans. And I didn't put a link to the plan-based model tutorials, but I'll make sure there is one on the HERA tutorial website if you want to dig into those. But we're going to look at causal agency models now. The tutorials are pretty good, but since they were written, some things have moved around a bit, and so sort of path names and stuff has changed. So I'll go through the tutorials and I'll talk you through what you actually need to type to get it to work with the current version of HERA on GitHub. So we start with a tutorial on utility-based causal agency models, and that's the one I'm going to look at in depth, and then I'll do a quick overview of the others. So the example that we look at here, as presented on the website, is a little bit abstract. So you have actions A1, A2, A3, you have background B1, and you have consequences C1, C2, C3, C4. So actually what I've done is I have rewritten this particular example with some more intuitive variable names just to give you a bit more of a feel for what's going on in this model. So the model that is presented in the tutorial you can find in the GitHub distribution for HERA. This is my updated version, and that will be available on the HERA tutorial website if you want to download it and play with it. So just to talk through what you can see here, we have a description of the model, the rescue robot dilemma, and this is based on a paper of Alan Winfield's, which actually I touch on in the implementation survey part of this tutorial. Then there are 3 actions you can take. You can save person 1, you can save person 2, or you can refrain from doing anything. Then we have this background information, that people are in danger. Now that doesn't mean people are actually in danger. That is listing this in the input file as a variable that can either be true or false. So we can investigate what it's ethical to do in situations when people are in danger, and also if we want what it's ethical to do in situations when people aren't in danger. And then we have consequences. And there are 4 consequences. Person 1 is safe, person 1 is scared, person 2 is safe, and person 2 is scared. Next we have the mechanisms, and the mechanisms are at the core of how HERA does causal reasoning. And you read these from right to left. So what we have here is the first mechanism says if people are in danger and you perform action save 1, then the result is that person 1 is safe. The second mechanism says that if you perform save 1, then person 1 is scared. So you'll have to come up with a little story about why this might be the case. Imagine this rescue robot is actually a kind of big, scary robot. So although it's fished somebody out of the rubble of some disaster, they're quite scared because this is a big, scary robot. And then the next 2 mechanisms are exactly the same, but for person 2. Then, because we're looking at utility-based models, we have some utilities. If person 1 is safe, that's a utility of 10. If person 1 is scared, that's utility of -4. And the same for person 2. If they're safe, utility of 10, and if they're scared, utility of -4. And then we have utilities for if they're not safe and they're not scared, and those are just the negative of the utilities if they're safe or scared, and so forth. And lastly, we have intentions, and that is because although intentions are not always relevant, in some of the models we might want to consider they are relevant. So this says what the intended outcomes of our actions are. So you can see that the intended outcome of saving person 1 is that you've actually done this action, that you've actually tried to save them, and that they are safe. And the intended outcome of saving person 2 is that you've saved them and they're safe. But crucially note here that the fact that they are scared is not one of the intended outcomes. That is some kind of side effect, but that's not part of the intention, at least in this description of what the robot was doing. So if I go back to sorry, everything's just come on. So if I go back to the tutorial and I scroll down, so you can see here ethical reasoning, and this is where it actually tells you the steps you need to go through in order to work with the HERA system. And these are all commands in the grey that you should type at the Python command line. And this is where, because things have moved around a bit, some of the paths and module names are different, and so I will just show you what you actually need to type here. So I'll just exit my last Python instance. So we start at Python, so I'm starting at Python 3, and then I'm going to import the two principles I want to work with. So I put in from ethics.cam.principles, and it's that addition of the CAM that is different from what you'll see on the tutorial website. Import, and we're going to look at the double effect principle and the utilitarian. So the utilitarian principle is the classic utilitarianism. So the permissible action is the one that has the highest overall utility. The double effect principle has a number of clauses to it, of which the one that will be most important here is that something's not permissible unless its overall utility is positive. So something has to be a kind of net good in the world. So we have these two principles. And we also need to import our causal models. So from ethics.cam, and again it's the CAM that is different, semantics, import causal model. And then we want to create a causal model. So M1 is a new causal model. And so first we will import this background file. And this is a YAML file, though you can also write these descriptions in JSON. So as you can see, I'm importing this from cases/cam/rescuerobotlouise.yaml. RescueRobotLouise isn't in there when you get it from the GitHub, but there's a rescuerobot.yaml which is exactly the same except with A's, B's and C's instead of save 1, save 2 and that kind of thing. And again, what's different from the tutorial website is you've got this extra directory, CAM. And then what we have to do is we have to describe the particular world that this model represents. So we let's start with the world in which we've saved person 1. So save 1 equals true, represented by 1. Save 2 is false, and refrain is false. So we're generally interested in worlds where you can only do one action out of those that are available. So we're doing save 1, and we're not doing save 2, and we're not doing refrain. And we are interested in moral permissibility of these actions in the worlds where the people are in danger. So I'll add that as well, people in danger, that background variable, people in danger is equals 1. And then, because we want to do utilitarianism, we need to be able to contrast our worlds with the alternative worlds, and we did the different actions. So we'll create M2, which is the world in which we save person 2, and we'll create M3, which is the world in which we refrain from doing anything. And then we actually need to inform each of these models about what the alternatives were. Now, on the tutorial website, it says to use a method called setAlternatives. That doesn't seem to work anymore. So you just want to write m1.alternatives equals. So the 3 worlds of interest here are M1, M2, M3. And the same for model 2, and the same for model 3. So we've set all the alternatives for comparison. And then these models have a method evaluate, which lets you evaluate the permissibility of that particular world. And given we're talking about worlds in which one particular action takes place, this boils down to the permissibility of that particular action. So let's say permissibility on world 1 equals m1 dot evaluate utilitarian principle. Permissibility in world 2 and permissibility in world 3. So if we print them out, then you see that it says that world 1, where we try to save person 1, is morally permissible. World 2, where we try to save person 2, is morally permissible. And the world where we refrained is not morally permissible. And if you add up all the utilities for those worlds, you'll see that the overall utility is the same whether you save person 1 or person 2, and it's higher than the utility if you refrain from doing either. So if, on the other hand, we look at the double effect principle, so remember, for the double effect principle, things are only permissible if that they represent a net good in the world. So you can't pick an action. So here you see they all say false. And again, if you add up the utilities for the cases, you see your utility can never get higher than 0 in any of these 3 worlds. So none of these options represents a net good, and so they are vetoed on the grounds of the double effect principle. We can also look at a different principle, which is the do no harm principle. So if I just go back and I import, so the do no harm principle says that something is not morally permissible if any of its consequences are negative. So if a negative consequence implies you've done some harm, so the idea is you're not allowed to do anything that has any negative consequences, even if the overall utility was positive. So if I check again my 3 worlds, but this time against the do no harm principle, then here you see in the do no harm principle, then actually only the world where you refrain from doing anything is morally permissible, because in that one there are no negative consequences of your actions. It's just bad, but do no harm is not sort of interested in the kind of background effects. So that's the utility models tutorial. I'm not going to talk in as much depth about the Kantian reasoning tutorial, but I will go into it briefly. So I bring back the web page. So here is the Kantian causality tutorial, Kantian causal agency. And sort of the key thing about this reasoning principle is that you cannot use someone as a means to an end. And the example they have here is a little situation where the robot wants to make Alice happy, and it knows that Alice is happy if Celia is happy, and it knows that it can make Celia happy by giving her flowers. So the idea here would be to give flowers to Celia and therefore make Alice happy. And that means you're using Celia as a means to the end of making Alice happy, and you're not actually interested in whether Celia, well, you're interested she's happy, but that's not really why you're doing it. And so you can see here the top half of the example in a kind of similar format as previously. We've got some mechanisms. If you give flowers, then Celia will be happy. If Celia is happy, then Alice will be happy. So the second mechanism, we've got a consequence of a consequence, and you can do that in HERA models. And then we have some goals, and goals are how this Kantian reasoner determines whether something is an end. So the goal of giving flowers is to make Alice happy. That's why you've chosen to do this. And then we have these effects which tell you who is affected by the various actions and consequences that might happen. So here we have Celia is happy, that's positive for Celia, and Alice being happy is positive for Alice. So even though Celia being happy is positive for Celia, what that's really telling the system is that Celia being happy has affected Celia, and if it's affected her and the goal doesn't affect her, then she's being used as a means and she isn't actually the end of the action. And if you wanted to, you could add some utilities in here, and then you could perhaps contrast the reasoning that the Kantian system is giving you here, which will say that you're not actually allowed to give flowers to Celia in order to make Alice happy, with some kind of utilitarian reasoning, which would say, well, you know, overall everybody's happy, so this is fine. If I scroll down, then once again, we have a few issues here with paths. So it says, you know, from ethics.principles import, and it wants to be ethics.cam principles. Same with from ethics.semantics. And underneath that, where you set up the model, it suggests that you can read this in from /Kantian cases /flower case JSON. And in fact, again, this is in cases /CAM, and there's a YAML file which is flowers.yaml. So I'll just show you this happening. So from ethics.cam.principles import Kantian humanity principle, and from ethics.cam.semantics import causal model. Well, we've already done that, sorry. And then we'll create a model. So in this case, I'm going to import cases /CAM /flowers.yaml. And the world I'm interested in the permissibility of is the one where I give flowers and I don't refrain. And because I'm not interested in utilitarianism here, I don't actually need to compare to what would happen in worlds where I did something different. That's not how the Kantian principle works. It just looks at the permissibility of the action in the world you're looking at now. So I don't need to set any alternatives. But obviously, if you wanted to extend this example, to put some utilities in to see what would happen, then you would want to set the alternatives there. So let's say model dot permissibility equals model dot evaluate Kantians. And here we see it says that this particular world is not morally permissible because you're using Celia as a means to an end. If you read on in that tutorial, there's also a bit about how you can generate explanations for why a particular ethical principle has given an answer that it has. I don't think those explanations are really totally understandable yet. I think if you want to get into picking them apart, you can see what they mean. So you're welcome to have a look at the explanations and there's also an explanation tutorial that we will link to. So if you want to look at how the explanation of the reasoning is working in HERA, you can do that. So if you're interested in having a go with an ethics reasoning system, this is one that at least is has plenty of examples and is hopefully easy to install. And I recommend, if you're interested, pick your favourite moral dilemma or ethical reasoning example, and see about coding it up in the various ethical principles. If you look at the HERA website, there's a list of publications, the various principles that have been implemented. They're all described in various publications which explain just exactly what those principles do and how they work, which will help you work through them. So have fun.